about that. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today is that I'm aware that the Rotary Club in Wellington have spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to reduce your own emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions. And I'd like to congratulate you on the work that you've been doing. But we've got a couple of things that are getting in the way of that having an effect. Okay, one is COVID, but the other is that the degree to which we reduce our emissions will affect how much we will have to adapt to what is already in the pipeline. Now, if we go to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they have been since 1990 reporting on the climate change as an issue, and they have said as recently as last year that it is irreversible and that there is only a small window to act to stop over the centuries for the impacts that are going to be happening now and the more that will be coming down the track and is inevitable. So they have been saying for some time that quite transformative and immediate actions are going to be needed. And this is going to have to be a combined effort of government, communities, sectors across the board in every country, everywhere in the world, to even get close to what they describe as the guardrail, which is the 2 degrees of heating, of warming, that we're on a trajectory to reach. Now, there are a number of factors that can affect that. But the main, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background quickly about the sort of impacts that we're likely to see whether or not we reduce emissions and how quickly we reduce those emissions. We already have present and imminent threats that are occurring on the high tides, and you see that around Wellington quite regularly. The coastal flooding in particular that occurs around the harbour relatively frequently now. The slowly emerging impacts are those around the effect of sea level rise, for example, on groundwater, and that will come up behind any defences that occur, that have been put in. And those defences will have a temporary effect while the groundwater will be coming up behind them. And you've seen where the groundwater has a tidal impact, those effects will be felt. And that is the case in Petone. It's also the case in South Dunedin, for example. We'll also continue to get these extreme events, and they will intensify across heavy rainfall, wind, fire, coastal storms, surges, and of course there will be surprises, and the accelerated sea level rise that will come from the accelerating melt of the Antarctic ice shelves, which are buttressing the ice sheets in West Antarctic and around the Antarctic, are the bits that we have to watch. But not only that, these will combine in places, particularly around the coast, and they'll cascade across all the systems that I've got there. So it effectively is going to affect everything, whether or not we reduce our emissions. Whoops, it's not going down for me. There we go. So what's exposed? The impacts that are already being affected have to be dealt with, and the front line of that is local government, which is already stressed and has a huge fiscal gap and caps on how they can borrow money and so forth. Now, these figures that I've shown here, the first lot, are the most recent figures from NIWA about the numbers of buildings and replacement costs that are exposed, and also exposed to what we call a 1 in 100 year coastal flood event, and also at 1 metre of sea level rise. Now, these so-called 1 in 100 year events are going to become more frequent. And for Wellington, the 30 centimetres of sea level rise means that we would have these events occurring every year. So it changes the frequency. And there's, the next figures come from local government New Zealand, and this is the sort of exposure that we have of assets around our country with 1 metre of sea level rise. But there are still significant impacts, as we have in the work we've been doing, that show that even small sea level rise increments of 10 to 20 centimetres, which have been predicted around the coast, and this is certain stuff, not uncertain, over the next 20 to 30 years will drive big increases in the frequency of the coastal flooding. Now, we call these sort of nuisance floods, but they're the ones that are going to be, if you like, creating the tolerance levels which the community won't accept, and which will drive action. So what we've effectively got is what we call an adaptation gap. And even if we were to meet the targets, the emissions in the atmosphere are already going to keep coming down the line for the near term anyway. Adaptation is going to be inevitable, and it's a very large burden on the world. Now, interestingly, the World Economic Forum in its last two global risk reports have recognised that climate change risks and policy failure to mitigate and to adapt to them is one of the gravest threats. And the options for reducing the emissions, of course, have been known for some time, but the willingness to act has been quite elusive. And just so that you're aware that there is stuff going on in New Zealand, and the Climate Change Response Act, which set up the Climate Commission, has a process to develop targets and develop emission. It has targets in the legislation, and it has processes to draw up budgets and plans to reach these targets of net zero by 2050, and with biogenic methane to some lower levels of aspiration in subsequent years. Now, those are set in statute. We also have a national risk assessment underway, which is almost complete and which will inform a national adaptation plan. And we are hoping that we get better statutory alignment and funding reform on its way with some of the RMA reforms that are underway currently. So now we have COVID on top of this. So why I've outlined this to you is to show you that this is happening anyway, and we're going to have to deal with it anyway. But now we've got COVID, so we've got some significant issues that arise. There's a question around whether our institutional arrangements are adequate enough to make informed decisions about adaptation in a COVID environment. And I think we've seen over the last few weeks the very swift changes in setting up a public health system, for example, which used to exist, and make investments in that very quickly so that we can actually manage this thing. Now, that's going to happen also with climate change. We're not entirely adequately arranged currently to do that, but some of these things are being dealt with, but not fast enough in my view. It's also going to exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. And if we think of the people who've lost their jobs in the last few weeks, there will be more of them. Think of the young people coming out of universities who will need jobs. This is really a high priority of people that are exposed to COVID, not in a public health sense, but in the sense of being economically exposed. And the people, like the people on the streets who are now living in motels, will they continue to live in motels? And how will that be dealt with in terms of funding? And that will be competing funding for adaptation responses. And there are real limitations to reacting to problems when they occur. And so the work that we've been doing is to try and look at anticipating what are some of those foreseeable risks. And the biggest one obviously is sea level rise, which is very certain out to mid-century. Just from the basics of heating up the ocean, warms it, and it expands. And that will have an effect on a great number of climate factors that affect us. We also, there are issues around understanding the interdependencies between agencies and assets. So we need to be thinking outside the silos and working together across silos. We need to be thinking about a design life of assets. Are they, if we're making decisions today, will they withstand the sort of problems that we're going to have? Sea level rise isn't going to stop anytime soon, probably for centuries. So how are we going to deal with that? There are also community expectations of levels of service to get the three waters, for example, into their homes. And as some of the heavy rainfall occurs and the sea level rises, water doesn't run uphill. So we're in for putting lots of money into potentially developing vacuum systems. Now, they are very expensive and very disruptive to the people who live around them. And of course, the elephant in the room is the funding issue, the funding deficit. to pay for all this and to pay for COVID or to pay for all this in an economy that is going to have a big hit for a few years. So there's some sort of paradigm shift is needed. And I deliberately put the children here because this is about our children's future, our grandchildren's future. We've made the mess, and I think it's incumbent on us to do something about it now. We've got uncertainty embedded in our futures. We can't wait for that uncertainty to be resolved. It won't be resolved. We know enough to be able to make flexible decisions in the future, and to make those in a preemptive way rather than a reactive way, because designing legislation and doing things when we're in the midst of a crisis is not good at any time. And we have the tools to deal with these issues already. And I put one of these up here. We've done a lot of work on this notion of having, broadly speaking, a number of options or actions that can be identified for the future. We make decisions today that can reduce path dependency in the future, or at least not make it worse. And this is designed as an adaptive and a dynamic adaptive system, which relies on designing what we call triggers and signals to give us some clue as to how we might navigate the future. A bit like going to the metro, and we can change direction, but some of them are dead ends. So this is about timely adaptation. We can stress test our options against different socioeconomic and emissions futures, and this enables us to be anticipatory rather than reactive, and not set in stone our directions for the future, but retain that flexibility, knowing that these big surprises are going to come along. So finally, what are the opportunities if we take a climate change lens? And I broadly took the Climate Commission's principles that it issued a few weeks ago for thinking about this problem, and turned them into questions, and how we might think about taking opportunities in a COVID-constrained environment. We want investments that deliver long-term climate benefits and reduce the costs on future generations. And there may be transformational investments that could be brought forward because we know they're inevitable in the future. Very importantly, the training and development of both climate-ready technologies can be accelerated, and also training and development of our workforce to use those climate-ready technologies is really important. We're looking at this notion of regulatory instruments to reduce emissions and stimulate adaptation as part of the recovery. And what can we learn from mana whenua, particularly about the concept of kaitiakitanga, which is about the stewardship and future-proofing for our future generations, a really important concept, which I think we have a lot to learn from. And then how can we integrate climate resilience, or if you like, the adaptations that we might do into that COVID world where those principles can be met. So that's just an overview to give you a taste of perhaps how one might think about adaptation in the future. But the big take-home message is that we will have to adapt, and we need to start soon, and we can't be adapting in a way that creates path dependency, so we're locked into things for the future, which will be very hard and expensive to get out of. So that's a plug for looking after our grandchildren. So thank you, Denise and Roger.
Sorry, Judy, that was a lovely reference at the end there, given I've just seen delightful photos of your little granddaughter over there in Belgium. And so now we have an opportunity for some questions, and I'm going to take some of the ones, Roger, you and I might want to share these, and Roger, you might need to take yourself off mute now. And if we alternate the questions, we'll keep an eye on them as we go. And I've got the first one, which is from Teresa, which is how are we going to respond to a world global flood? And I guess metaphorically spinning the world off its axis. But I guess this was really a focus in on sea level change and flooding impacts. Anything more to say about that, Judy?
Well, I think the risk assessment, which will be out shortly, will be able to identify where these are key issues in New Zealand, and that will be used as a basis to develop a national adaptation plan. Now, we're not sure what shape that will take, but obviously we are very aware already where these places are, well known, and it's a question of prioritising those in terms of a number of criteria that will have to be developed. But that is work that can move quite quickly because there is quite a bit known about it already. So the sorts of things that can happen are development of plans that can deal with the sea level rise. Long term, there will be retreat, no doubt. The question is, how can that be done in a way that is not so disruptive that people's lives are totally affected, that, you know, they haven't got the means to cope. So what that means is that the funding and the processes have to be in place to deal with that. And
okay, Judy, I've got a second question here, which is from Russ Ballard. And the question is relatively, which is the most useful strategy for mitigating greenhouse gases? Emissions reduction or sequestration?
Well, my own view is it's emissions reduction. If we can get them as fast, the direct emissions have to be locked in for the future. And in my own view, sequestration is a temporary measure. It's a transitional measure, and no doubt will play a part. But to be effective, one has to lock in the sequestration forever. And there are all sorts of administrative and institutional reasons why that will be extremely difficult. So that's my own personal view from experience being involved in this for a long time. But I think we have to rapidly decarbonise our economy globally. And there will be transitions to that, no doubt.
So Judy, and this question from Lee. So Judy, do you see any climate change projects that could be ready to roll with the government's current goal, post-COVID goal, of rapidly getting into shovel-ready projects?
Well, I think there are lots of them. I received an email this morning from somebody who has a land use waste project that can put together waste and produce useful products for the rural community. There are electrical and engineering solutions that can reduce the use of coal in the dairy industry that I'm aware of. There are a number. Those are just two off the top of my head. But the question is, all of these have to be carefully worked on to see how they can be used immediately, scaled up, transitioned over time, etc. So they have to be able to be practically implemented. Implementability is key, and speed of implementability.
So we don't have any other questions as yet, but I think we're probably just about out of time, are we, Denise?
Yeah.
We are, Roger. So I'll ask you to round up now with thanks.
Well, could I just say on behalf of the members, Judy, thank you very much for coming along today and sharing that with us. You are in the box seat now, of course, as a member of the Climate Commission in terms of setting or recommending targets to the government for carbon budgets to get us to net zero carbon by 2050. So if I can just take your takeaway messages, perhaps the summary of what you were saying, that we will have to adapt. We need to start soon, and we must leave the world a better place for our children and our grandchildren. So could I ask the members to give you a virtual thank for a great presentation? Thanks, Judy.
Okay, thanks very much, and all the best for your endeavours. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And I know